It's right on 1:30, folks, 12:30, so we might kick off. There's people just coming in, but they'll pick it up as we go through this. My name is Mick Gooda. I'm the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner at the Human Rights Commission. And as we stand here today on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, I pay my respects to them, their elders past and present, and salute them for their struggle for their country and their culture to keep it alive in the biggest city that we have in Australia. It's appropriate that we do these welcome to countries because what we're going to talk about today is actually something really modern. It's DNA, it's genetics, and we've just got to work out how do we fit the concept of us being here for so long in with this new science that's almost evolving on a daily basis. Even Simon will talk about it a bit more, but even since we've started this process about 2.5 years ago, advances have been made in genetics that'll just astound you. So where I'll start is I was approached along with a group of other people, including Marcia Langton, Mick Dodson, Ian Anderson, Kerry Arabina, about a collection of 6,000 samples that were held by ANU. And they were tissue samples, which basically were blood samples. If you go down and have a look, Simon will talk a bit about it, little vials about this high, that were collected up to 50 years ago across Australia. And again, Simon will talk a bit more about the project, what it was meant to do. It was back in the 50s, a genetics project, a worldwide genetics project, but we had the specific part about Indigenous people. And of course, our mob in Australia got caught up in that. Now, we sort of take a view, and the general view is that the tissue samples were collected in line with the ethics of the day. So we can't find any evidence of people being strapped to beds and blood taken away from them, but there's generally, when we've gone out and talked to people about it, we've generally got a really great reaction from people with lots of good memories about the people. There are actually a few of the people still alive who actually went out as young doctors to go and take these samples. So we'll get into that a bit. We'll talk about some of the possibilities of genetic research. We'll talk a bit about the history of where we are in Australia with the research with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of this kind. And we'll talk about the role of the National Centre for Indigenous Genomics, which was created out of those consultations that were undertaken about 2.5, 3 years ago. But as we started on this process, the first thing we decided to do was to make sure we engaged with the people whose tissue samples were taken all that time ago. And we know that lots of people have passed away. We've got extensive lists of names of people who had samples taken. One thing they did was keep good records. So what we have is 3 parts of this collection. One is the blood samples. The second is the records of people whose blood was taken. In fact, there's some of them are really useful because they've drawn up the whole family connections in particular communities. Didn't happen in all of them, but some of them you go out and you talk to people now about them, and they want to hold those records because they're pretty important about who's related to who and all that stuff. And the third part of the collection is a massive number of photographs, and we'll show you some photographs today. You'll be amazed. I constantly say there's a photograph of this guy. I reckon he's the coolest black fella in Australia, taken about 50 years ago. He's just so cool, this bloke. When you see him, you'll know what I mean. So people are really interested in the photographs and all these records, and our job is to make sure they go back to the appropriate people. So we embarked on this. All the scientific stuff was happening on one end. Then we decided to embark on this consultation. And our first view was we have to go and talk to people and let them know what we've got. And our first place we went to was Fitzroy Crossing in the Kimberley, and it's lucky my brother worked up there as CEO of the Kimberley Law and Culture Centre, which brings all the Kimberley old people, lawmen, lawwomen together to talk about cultural stuff happening in the Kimberley. And we met with them. They were the first people we met with. And funny enough, outside their building is about 2 containers of remains that have been brought back from overseas, out of museums across Europe, basically. Lots of them have been reburied, but there's lots in those containers. They don't know. They know they come from the Kimberley, but they don't know which community they come from. And we think this project can help them find that out as one of the benefits of it. So we just started really talking to people about what we've got. Now we've taken a view, and even now, Simon, I don't think people wanted to sign up to it straight away, and we told them up front we don't even have the consent forms developed yet. So we haven't even got to the point of thinking about what you're going to give consent for. We just want to talk about it. So that time taken actually produced a lot of confidence and trust in what we're doing. So the concept is people won't move from the closed collection to an open collection until we get permission of either the people themselves or the people we are told speak for those people who've passed away. So we've got this process happening now. A fella from Fitzroy Crossing is helping us there. There's a lady in Queensland helping us, and a fella up in the top end we're working with.
We're working with the Machado Joseph Disease Foundation.
Yeah, the Machado Joseph disease. I don't know if you've heard of the Machado Joseph disease up in the top end. We think this project can actually help advance some of the remedies to the ailments those people suffer. Can I welcome our president, Gillian Trigg? Sorry, Gillian. So what it's turned into, I think it's gone down 2 tracks. One is really the scientific basis of analysing the DNA and all that. But the other side is actually engaging with the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander community. And I venture to say we're actually designing the gold standard. Lots of resources are going into making sure we engage properly. We've got a young woman from North Queensland, Azure Hermes, formerly Azure Peacock, working with us, and she leads the engagement strategy along with those other people as we go through Queensland, the top end, and the Kimberley area. Now, it might seem strange, but there's actually no regulation around this. About the use of DNA, particularly from the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander perspective. In the 90s, there was a project where our mob weren't involved at all. We call it the Vampire Project, and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people just excluded themselves from it. So we were coming in with a very fraught reputation around genetics and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, and funny enough, because they reckon we're the oldest people in the world, the geneticists around the world just want to get their hands on our stuff. Now, Simon got online one day and actually bought Aboriginal DNA online. So there's no control. So part of the thing we've got to build out of this process is actually how do we regulate the access and the use of Aboriginal DNA? And so what the principles we've taken forward for the National Centre for Indigenous Genomics is every step of the way Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people will be in control of the decision making. Whether it's the Board of Governance, I chair it, and there's on the board with me is Mick Dodson, 3 young researchers, doctors, Misty Jenkins, she's an immunologist, just moved from the Peter Mac Institute in Victoria. I'm not sure where she is now. It's only happened in the last little while. Simone Reynolds from Queensland Institute of Medical Research, and Nari Brown, a doctor in her own right, but then is a PhD scholar as well. So we've got these 3 young women on the board who make sure, along with Mick and I, make sure that the Aboriginal view is put fairly strongly. And I think it's safe to say there's no one amongst those, the 5 of us, who are actually shrinking violets when it comes to putting our view out there. But we're joined by Simon as the director of the centre, Don Chalmers, who is an ethicist, who's really important that we have get the ethical framework around this right. Margaret Harding, who's the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of ANU Research, and I think that's about it. That's the group. We've got a research advisory committee, which will eventually look at the use of the DNA when we're ready for it. It'll be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, a majority of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders in charge of that. We've established a collection, what we call a collection access committee, who actually gets to look at this stuff. That's going to be majority Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander control. So we've actually got to build the confidence of our mob out there that as we go into this, it's going to be done right. And you can't emphasise too much about getting it done right. Where we go with this, look, I don't know. And as we finish, I think we're going to have a Q&A session. And some of the things, I'll prompt some of them. They think you can go and get your DNA done and you'll work out whether you're Aboriginal or not. That can't happen. Simon will explain why. I'm getting calls, and I think a couple of other people are getting calls to work out native title claims. Can I connect myself to an apical ancestor somewhere using DNA? Benefit sharing, if something, if some great cure was found for something out of this, it could be how to actually make sure benefits are shared back to the people who participate in this. And there's a great book you should read. It's called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, who was an African-American woman in the 50s. And she died of cancer. And they call it The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks because her bloodline, cell lines have been used all around the world. They've gone to outer space. And when I read the book, the amount of benefit that accrued to her family was basically zilch. I think the first thing all the pharmaceutical companies did was pitch in and buy a headstone for her grave. But and so we got all these moral dilemmas as well. You know, I was reading a couple of years ago about there's this family in Australia. It's a non-Aboriginal family who have this marker in their genetic makeup that if they've got this gene, they'll have an 80% chance of getting stomach cancer. And when I read it, the family divided into 2 groups. One who wanted to know what happened if they had the gene, and the other who didn't want to know. They said, we'll just find out if we get cancer, work it out. Then the other group who wanted to know get divided into 2 groups. The people with the gene, the people without the gene. Then it goes to the people with the gene. What do you do? And that stage, I don't know if there's any advance being made, but the way to deal with that is have your stomach removed. Pretty dramatic thing. You would have seen people like Angelina Jolie being found with that breast cancer gene and had a double mastectomy to deal with it. So we got all these things that are going to confront all of us in this genetic world. We worry about, I've got my genome mapped. I don't think we're going to show it today. So we worry about the moral dilemmas of if you've got a marker for cancer, how will that affect disclosure statements when you're getting insurance for all sorts of things? So is it better not knowing and sign your insurance statement, then go and get it done? So these are the dilemmas we're all going to confront, but we think there are particular dilemmas for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this as well. So I might get Simon to join me up here, and he'll go through what actually we've done so far and where we've come from. But then I think I know it sparked my interest about the possibilities, the potential for this sort of research to benefit our mob, particularly in closing the gap. And there's also a moral argument that given that we cannot exit the whole system here. But again, for individuals getting involved, it's going to come down to individuals saying yes or no. So if you can make Simon welcome, and he'll take us to the next step.
Thanks very much, Mick, and I'll reserve my acknowledgements to later on, as you'll see. How do I control this? Can you make it full screen? Okay, should be possible, but okay. Well, okay. So as Mick said, he chairs the National Centre for Indigenous Genomics at the board, the governance board, and of which I'm the director at the ANU. And I'm going to go through what we do in more detail, following on from Mick. But first, perhaps a little bit of background. There must be a way to make this big.
You'll make a full screen.
Yeah, and also, how do I move on? I use a Mac. I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing here, so maybe if you can control that. Can you get rid of that? I don't know how that works. Sorry. There are, while that's happening, there are very large projects occurring around the world, and there are major initiatives to understand how our genomes are involved in affecting how our environments influence our health, and how genetic variation between people affects that process. And this is underpinned by large databases of genomic and related data. So this is an example of big data, which is being addressed in different ways throughout all sorts of areas, particularly sensitive and important in this area because it's very personal and relates to people's health and to their identity. So these large data sets are critically important because they provide essential context for interpretation of individuals. As Mick said, his genome's been sequenced, mine's been sequenced. We can't make any sense of that unless we compare it with other genomes. And so there are literally millions of people having their genome sequenced. These are important for internal quality control purposes. The more background information you have, you can see where there might be errors and so on. They're essential for discovery and scientific inference in relation to disease or anything else for that matter, and for clinical interpretation. And I'll give you an example of that later on. These are being built through disease-specific, but also large national projects. It's almost like the airlines. Every country has to have one of these. And the two, perhaps the largest and best known, are Genomics England, where they are sequencing 100,000 people. That'll be exceeded massively. And there are, of course, other projects within the United Kingdom. There's now a Genomics Scotland, not to be outdone. The National Institutes of Health in the United States, again, not to be undone, are looking at sequencing a million people. And the important point in the headline there is that this is being done to form the foundation for a new way of doing research through engaged participants and responsible data sharing. So there are a lot of new issues arising in this context because there is a need to connect with people in a rather different way than has been done in the past, both from the point of view of clinicians and researchers, but also to retain that connection over time, and also to work out how to share data to make it more and more useful without compromising issues around privacy and related matters. And the point here is that the current focus, for historical reasons that you would all understand, the current focus is on rare diseases and cancer. It's extending beyond that, but that's where the action is at the moment. But it's based on people from Europe, ancestrally from Europe, whether they live there or not. Now, you can tell a lot from someone's genome about where they come from, and this is, in fact, my genome. And you can compare that by comparison to data that's collected from other populations around the world. And this list here is, it doesn't really matter, but the point is that this is essentially blue because I'm British. I'm completely 100% British. And, but I have a colleague who's from Colombia, and his genome looks like this. There is in there, these are so I should explain, these are our 22 chromosomes down here, and you painted on them the components of those chromosomes that come from different ancestry. So my colleague and friend Mauricio has African American, West African, he has largely Native American, some Iberian Peninsula Spanish, and some Jewish, both Sephardic and Ashkenazi components there. There's a whole, in other words, he's a fairly typical Colombian. He identifies, by the way, as being Colombian. So you can tell that these components, now this has an implication, this has implications for health because there are subtle differences. These are most important in rare diseases and also in cancer. This means that there's a disparity because if we restrict our knowledge to people from Europe, then people from Europe will benefit disproportionately, and other people will fall behind. There are large initiatives in genomics and health in the Americas, and these are initial funding to these projects, and there's a big project in Africa, international project, and that's that moment's been leveraged substantially. Now the quote at the bottom is from the H3 Africa Consortium paper that was published a couple of years ago, and it says basically, if the dearth of genetics research, including Africans, persist, the potential health and economic benefits emanating from genomic science may elude an entire continent. So if people are left out, they will lose out. If we look at what we know about Indigenous Australian genomics, the maps of genome diversity around the world generally look a bit like this. In other words, sometimes Australia isn't even on them, but certainly when it is, New Zealand isn't on. Oh, New Zealand is on that one. When it is, there's no information available from there. So a similar investment we would suggest is needed to extend the health and other benefits to Indigenous Australians. But that isn't a simple process. This for many of the reasons that Mick has already outlined. And I'll give you just a couple of examples of what I was saying about the local implications of genome variation in relation to health. This is a study a couple of years ago on Inuit people from Greenland, and the map there shows the villages where the samples were obtained, and in a genome study, a variant of this gene, that's name is not important, that had not previously been identified as being associated with diabetes in any way, was found to result in a 10-fold increase in the risk of diabetes in Inuit. Now, that is a huge effect and has all kinds of downstream implications in terms of development of therapeutics, but also in terms of treatment. And that graph at the bottom just shows that in a different form. It also associated with insulin resistance and glucose levels and so on. The point is that this variant occurs nowhere else in the world. It occurs in 23% of Inuit. It occurs nowhere else. I believe there is one Japanese sample that it was seen in, but that's at a level that you could probably consider as error. So it's essentially specific to this region, and it has this huge health effect. Now, the direct implication of that is, as Mick will tell you, because I was with him when someone said this to us jointly, I do everything my doctor says. I have diabetes, I do everything my doctor says, as they keep telling me I'm not following the regime, I'm not doing what I'm told to do by my doctors. I do, but it has no effect. The point is that in these people, to a large extent, diabetes is a different disease and needs a different regime of treatment for it. Now, we don't know the extent to which that's more generally the case, but it's certainly a good example of why it's important to recognize this. There are these local differences that may be very important. Closer to home, a study last year of a family with a genetic disorder in the Western Desert, and the genetic services, clinical genetic services people that were working on this published this article, and the point that's highlighted there in the abstract of their paper is that they were able to identify this mutation, and they thought that it was causal. If it was causal, then it meant they treated the affected people in this family differently. But they couldn't work out whether it was causal because they didn't know if it was simply something that was common, not found elsewhere, but common in the Western Desert, but had no impact. And unlike diabetes, which is common in Inuit, this disorder was only restricted to one family. So if this was common in the Western Desert, it was almost certainly non-pathogenic. So they highlight the path to determination of pathogens was confounded by the lack of genomics reference data from Australian Aboriginals. Is in their abstract there and emphasised throughout their paper. So one of the important things that we're trying to do here is to rectify that deficiency, if you like. This, as Mick outlined, has all come about as a result of a collection of samples that were obtained in the last century from, I think, 43 collection sites, but people are from more communities than are represented by those collection sites. We keep finding more samples, actually, but there are approximately 7,000. So we have had an obligation to find a way to appropriately manage these samples. The collections are in freezers, and I'll talk about that later, but as Mick also mentioned, there are field notes, correspondence, information, photographs about families and communities, which have been as of much interest as the genetic information, not just in communities, but certainly in communities, and but also to potentially to researchers, although they haven't been used for that purpose so far. And so they're very well kept records. People kept records properly in those days, and they are very detailed in some cases. And they were collected for a variety of health and medical purposes. This was not an anthropological study, it was a health and medical study. It was at a time when people were discovering diseases like sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis, Tay-Sachs, that were genetic, and they were common, but they were only occurred in people from particular parts of the world or who ancestrally came from particular parts of the world. In the case of sickle cell anemia, West Africa, and cystic fibrosis is largely European, and Tay-Sachs, of course, only occurs in Ashkenazim. So this was then spurred an interest in collecting samples and looking for, using the technology of the day, variation, genetic variation in blood markers and so on that might be associated with disease. We have, as Mick said, a wonderful sample collection, and I'll just go through these quite quickly. It gives you a sense of the context of the collection. This is from the Western Desert. This is the guy that Mick thinks is the cool, is the guy on the right is the cool guy. There's a very interesting story which keeps getting more interesting about this man, which we might have time to talk about later, but very amusing story. We've been trying to find out who he is, and that becomes more and more interesting and amusing as we go along. Again, in the Kimberley, on the shores of the Forest River, and in Warburton, from Mona Mona in North Queensland, and so on. So this gives a sense of the thing. And let's just go back to this one, because I think if you look at this, and if you look at the records, and if you look at the correspondence at the time, and it's very extensive, this looks like a fairly relaxed process. It wasn't, there's no indication that this was done in a coercive way. It doesn't have that feeling about it. Nevertheless, we assume that we know nothing about how this has happened until we either speak to people and find out who were directly involved. There were, of course, no ethics committees in those days. There was no national statement and so on. But we take the view that we're going back to people and telling them about this and asking them what they want to do now. We don't, whatever was said before has no weight as far as we're concerned. Just to point out that this is part of a larger collection that we have, which was collected for much the same reasons, mainly from this part of the world, but in all about 400,000 samples were collected. And the reasons for this and so on are varied and so on. So it's actually probably one of the largest collections in the world, if not the largest of this kind. We were set up, as I said, we were born out of the need to manage this collection, this extraordinary collection, but in the process of doing that, we now provide a more general framework to enable Indigenous Australians to benefit from genome science, and we'll go through that. We asked people, a group of Indigenous people, to essentially tell us what to do. We put ourselves in their hands. Mick was part of that group. It was chaired by Professor Ian Anderson at the University of Melbourne, and we suggested, whatever you tell us, we will do it. If you tell us to throw this lot away, we'll throw it away. If you tell us to give it back to people, we'll do that. If you tell us to put it back in the freezers for the next 50 years, we'll do that. If you tell us we should use it, we'll do it whichever way you tell us to do it. I won't go through these people in detail, but you'll be familiar with most of them, I'm sure. They made recommendations to the ANU, and we were kind of stunned by how important they thought this was, that this collection was of immense cultural, historical, and scientific importance. So they were very keen to stress that this had a potential that went well beyond science. And they wanted us to manage this, and they saw this as, if we did this properly, it would be a watershed in the history of Indigenous research and bioethics in this country, and a model for people doing this kind of work around the world. I hesitate to say that because I think some people around the world are doing these things extremely well, so I don't want to suggest that otherwise. But that's the committee's view, and they wanted us to establish an Indigenous governance board to oversee this, that would ensure that Indigenous people were, as Mick outlined earlier, in charge of the process in its entirety at all levels. We did that, and he's mentioned the members of that board, and that will develop and grow over time. This is just a photograph from our first meeting with a few hangers on like me. No, I'm on the board. I'm allowed. So we then it's set up as a department within the university. It has a research advisory committee, an Indigenous access committee, and a comprehensive set of ethics. Our ethics protocol has been approved by the university committee and has been endorsed by some of the appropriate regional Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander health ethics committees, and is currently with the West Australian Committee as we speak. So, and just to point out that this really was we put a hold on all work on this collection until we had proper engagement with Indigenous people, and it had stopped being used, and it had fallen into disrepair. So it was in freezers, in closets, and broom closets, and in boxes and so on. In this way, so we had a huge effort to pull this together and to get it into reasonable shape and into modern storage facilities and so on, which we've done over the past 2 or 3 years. The challenges here, the governance issue, and we can talk about that in Q&A, participant and community engagement. Mick's already mentioned we have a wonderful community engagement coordinator. The ethics presents a number of interesting challenges and problems. We don't feel that the current way in which human ethics committees, which is a compliance-based model with a Q&A format where you say you're going to do this, is really appropriate. So we've really changed the architecture of that and put the governance board in a much more central place, still answerable to the Institutional Ethics Committee, but the governance board will really, and therefore Indigenous people will be in charge of determining the way in which we conduct things ethically. Consent is a big issue in this whole area, because this is stuff I say, material that's collected from people that may be used for a whole variety of different purposes over a long period of time. And so there are models of consent being developed called dynamic consent, which I won't go into in detail here, but we might elaborate on later, where people can continuously engage with, you have to maintain the connection with people, and they can continuously give an indication of the nature of their preferred involvement in the process. There are infrastructure issues that are massive, and they're being dealt with on international and national and institutional levels, but these are not insubstantial at all. They're very, very substantial and expensive. It's important to integrate with other initiatives around the world, both and around Australia, and we spend a lot of time in those kind of negotiations. Data access control, as I said, we have the Access Control Committee. We want to bring people together from all of the communities we're working with to work out exactly how that's going to work. At this stage, that's not something where it's not an immediate problem, but it's something we want to start working on now. Education and capacity building. There are, as far as we're aware, no Indigenous researchers working in this area. And so what we would like to do in embedding the areas of bioinformatics and genomics and related areas, embedding the research excellence within this Indigenous governance framework, we can then, that forms the basis then for education and training and capacity building from a sound basis of research excellence within an Indigenous controlled context. And we will no doubt be talking more during Q&A about legal and ethics issues. There are issues about rights and ownership and here, which are very interesting and complex. And then there is a whole series of political, social, historical and cultural issues. And we've made an important point, and I should say that I got started on this project when I got a call from Eva Koval, who was then at the University of Melbourne, she's a qualified medical practitioner, but also has a PhD in anthropology, and she's the deputy director of the centre. And so worked very closely, collaboratively with Emma over this entire period. And through that collaboration, we've been very insistent against, in terms of my talking to my scientific colleagues, that we build in from the start expertise, research endeavours, and knowledge about in these areas, so that we're really, again, within the Indigenous governance framework, being proactive in developing appropriate ways of doing things from the very start. So this is just to illustrate, this came out last week in the journal Science. It's an organisation, the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, and it gives an architecture of which we have to fit into. Now, they set a set of standards up at the top there. There is application programming interfaces, technical standards. They've got privacy and security, and those things are being built and developed now. And then we have researchers or clinicians down the bottom, and then these little wheelie things in the middle there are just sort of groups of research efforts that are individually controlled, so that, and we would be one of those little bits in there. And so we can, this is a way of allowing us to engage with all of the other activities that are going around the world, but having control at a local level. So it's a federated system with a fairly complex access control and legal structure system around it. So that is, that's what's happening globally, and we're having to figure out how we fit into this sort of scheme, which is all brand new. I may skip this. This gives you a sense of how our access control system works, but perhaps we can come back to that in the Q&A session, because it's a bit complicated. So our model really is to have strong community-based governance and control combined with institutional ethical oversight. We have an independent access committee. The first dot point, the governance board, plays the key role. We have dynamic participant consent, which maintains an ongoing relationship with people, and there's a technological challenge there, which is, particularly the case in remote communities, and but allows people to engage dynamically over time. And the absolutely key fundamental thing is direct participant and community involvement in the whole process. So we have a very, now I think very good, solid, sound community engagement process. And Mick has described it as platinum class recently. The response has been fantastic, and and we can talk about how we do that. A key to that is on the right there is your Hermes, who's our community engagement coordinator, and on the left is Neil Carter, who's the heritage officer for the Kimberley Aboriginal Law and Cultural Centre, who'll be working with carefully in the Kimberley, closely with the Kimberley. So we always put ourselves in the community hands, working through the community and elders to the families, and we take as long as it takes. I think we've been back to the Kimberley about 6 times now, something like that, and we haven't asked anyone for consent at this point. So that's the way we go. We take this, and this presents me with a huge challenge, because the people who are providing us with funds and the institution I work in want some results, and results to them mean genome sequenced. So I'm having to manage that tension all the time and pushing back against that, because we are absolutely fundamentally committed to doing this the right way, which will take time. Now, giving back, Mick has already mentioned photographs. There's been an extraordinary response in communities to the way we've gone and asked them how they'd like us to do this. And there's an example recently of a fairly fractious community just coming together around this process in a way that Neil Carter, I showed you a minute ago, has never seen before. So it's been a very, far from being divisive, it's been a process that's been quite the opposite. And some of these photographs have been people who've either never seen themselves as young people before, photographically, or of people that they had never seen a photograph of who was important to them. So instead of the photographs have profound importance, but also the records and just the process itself. So I just would put this up. I'm going to put this up because it sort of illustrates this point. So there is, I think, a whole range of rights issues here, and a number of dimensions. And of course, fundamental to this is the inclusion and equity argument about the fact that people need to be involved directly with this kind of research to gain the benefits from it. And it is happening, it's going to happen, it's not going to stop, it's not going to go away. But there is also this effect of just going back properly to communities and doing things respectfully. And this is a report from Azure from a recent trip. And a man she talked to, who'd had a sample taken from him as a child, and he said that the idea of someone keeping this a secret in Canberra was wrong, and that no one has ever considered the cultural implications of this. After a meeting, he invited her to go with him so that he could explain further about his past and why he had these feelings. He said that he became angry today because these samples were taken in a time when so much had already been taken from him. He was taken from his family, his country, his culture, and now he learns that his blood was also taken. He wondered what else would be taken from him. He said he understands that what we're trying to do, and he liked her honesty when I answered all of his questions and thought that I explained things clearly and sensitively. He thinks that what NSIG is doing is important and can be helpful for future generations, and that there are high probability that he will give his consent. But he wanted to make sure that I understood how hurtful this was to him, and how this stirred some memories and emotions up for him, which he thought he had made peace with. He said that this would be at the front of every person's mind when we talk to them about these samples, and indeed, that's the experience we've had. So it's a question. This is not a simple process. It takes time, and we have to allow people to go through the emotional process associated with what has happened historically, so that they can now become properly engaged now into the future. So to summarise, we think that there is a potential here for reciprocal transformation through engagement. So we hope that this is a transformative experience for the communities and the people in them that we work with. So the NIH promise I mentioned earlier was to do a whole new way of doing research. We think that we are doing that in this project, and in fact leading the world in doing that, because we but we hope that others might learn from this engagement, and maybe Indigenous communities can show how right way research is a good thing for everyone. And I just want to show personally what this means to me, because I have worked in laboratories all my life. To me, that's a sample. You go to the freezer, the fridge, you pull it out, you do some analysis on it, you get some data, you write it up and publish a paper, and you move on. And that's really how I've always seen the contents of freezers. But I've come to realize through this process, and it's emphasized particularly from some people who see these samples as extensions of people or representations of people, and have talked about how they may be stored and who they should be stored appropriately next to in the freezers. And they want to come to Canberra and to help us to figure out how to do that. So there's a spiritual connection, a deep connection between people and this material that I had never really understood or considered before. So, and that has really transformed the way I think about the research that I do, not just in relation to Indigenous people, but more generally. And I think that's something that this is an example of something that this project can do in, and so I would like to, having said that, with a photograph of the material from the freezers, say that I would like to pay my respects to those Indigenous Australians who donated the blood samples that were the foundation of our collection, and to their descendants, both present and future. And with that, I'm going to show you a movie, which somebody else is going to organise. So we have a... This is a movie that we use as part of the community engagement process. And I'm hoping the sound works, does it?
Yeah, we test.
Imagine your veins are like rivers and your blood is like their waters, with lots of stories to tell. They actually let us know where we come from and explain to us why we get sick. These stories are already in the blood in our bodies and are written in language that doctors and scientists can understand. These stories are called DNA, and the stories come from both our mothers and fathers. They got the DNA stories from their mothers and fathers, who got it from their mothers and fathers. Because this has been going on for thousands of years, DNA stories can tell the story of a very, very big family. People share some of their stories with other people from the same area, even if they are not from the same family or clan. So when we look into the story of the DNA for a person, we also see a little part of the DNA story of their ancestors from thousands of years ago. Understanding the DNA stories can help scientists to understand more about why some families and communities have lots of people with diseases like diabetes and kidney problems, and other families have only a few. It can also help us understand why medicines work well for some people, but for other people they don't work or can even make them sick. Long time ago, small bits of blood called samples were taken from Aboriginal people in communities all over Australia. Right now, the samples are being kept at the Australian National University in Canberra. A mob called the National Centre for Indigenous Genomics, NCIG, are looking after them. This mob have a board with mostly Aboriginal people. They know it's important for us to know about our blood and our stories. They are not really sure how much those old people knew about giving their blood samples. So they think that their families should be able to decide now what to do with them. If you and your family decide that the sample should stay in the collection, the NCIG mob would get the DNA story out of the sample and read the story of the blood onto computers. The DNA stories from each sample will be put together with the stories from all around Australia to make a library. The stories in this library computer will have no names, only the DNA story and the community where the sample came from. Sometimes researchers, like doctors, who are looking to find out more about diseases might ask to look at some of the DNA stories. They will have to ask the NCIG mob first. If the NCIG mob think that their project could help Aboriginal people, they will let them read the story, only for that project. The NCIG mob are being very careful to make sure that Aboriginal people are in charge of decisions about who can read the stories and what they can read them for. You'll be able to see what the sample is being used for on an app on your mobile phone or computer. So you can say no anytime you want to using that app. This is a very new thing for everyone, but the NCIG mob want to make sure that the DNA stories can be used to help Aboriginal families and all Aboriginal people. Keeping these stories might be very important for all Aboriginal people. What do you mob think about that?
Can we stop it? For people who want to know, there was Charlie King. He's a broadcaster, an Aboriginal guy broadcaster from Darwin, who narrated it. So we're pretty proud of that. I think it explains DNA in a really easy way. So, look, some of the things we're going through now, and what Simon mentioned about the Inuit people from Greenland, you know, one of the worst things, and we found this in my last job, if people weren't compliant with their medication, they basically got written off. So if you don't look after yourself on dialysis, there's no way you would ever be a candidate for a kidney transplant. These people can't, it doesn't matter what the medicine does, they're generally not going to improve. So there was all these images building up of these people who just don't care about themselves, so why should we care? But the fact was their genetic makeup didn't allow it to happen. So there's all these things that sort of impact on the way the medical profession, the clinicians treat people. When we see sometimes they've got no control over how it happens. So that's where we are at the moment. We will be writing a part of this story in the Social Justice Native Title Report this year and putting a particular human rights element on it, starting from free, prior and informed consent, and how do we go through that with what Simon mentioned, the dynamic consent process, so if people can pull out any time they like. We haven't developed the app yet, the same as we haven't developed the consent form. So we're getting there now. So I might, Simon, if nothing else, we might just open up for questions. You might join us up here.
Do you want to sit down over there? Or well, maybe just stand here. Oh, yeah.
We'll sit down.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for the very useful information you gave us, and I'm sure most of us are quite unaware of this side of genomics. But my question is, how is it related to human rights? How do we relate it towards human rights?
Well, like I said before, the first thing is consent. You cannot, it goes way back to people, whether you're getting treatment in hospital or being part of a research project, you've got to give consent. So our job is really making sure, and that's a human right, to participate in decisions that affect you, to give free, prior and informed consent. So first of all, we'll start from that perspective. But the other thing will start, and we're just discovering this as well, how people actually use the research that's coming up. Because, you hear the stories about how many Aboriginal people are addicted to alcohol. There's some anthropologists think there's a gene that makes us addicted to it. Now, they sort of ignore the fact there's more Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people don't drink than the general population. But so the human rights aspect of it, as we get through to this, like I said, and it's going to affect all of us in one way or another. What about things like product disclosure if you've got your genome mapped and you've got a marker that makes you susceptible to some form of cancer? How does that affect? Will you be able to get insurance? All that sort of stuff. So we're just discovering some of this at the moment.
Most of those Aboriginal people you showed in the movie, I have noticed that they are mixed breed.
Well, we don't. Can I have to pull you up there because we don't actually go into that. You either are Aboriginal or you're not. It's a binary decision you got to make here, and there's no way if someone wanted to come up and determine degrees of Aboriginality, which you can't do, and someone wanted to discover that, there's no way that would ever make it through either the ethics committee or the the governance board of the centre. So. Sorry, but that's a big part of our world and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander affairs in Australia.
So to perhaps clarify that the element of ancestry is only a component to identification as Indigenous, and that is conventionally being done through records, birth, marriage, and death records, genealogies, and word of mouth. This simply provides an extension of that process, but doesn't in any way otherwise impact on your identity, culturally, ethically, whatever identity. From a genetic point of view, it means that there may be, and indeed there are good examples of families with Huntington's disease, for example, that are being treated in Indigenous communities. The gene that causes the Huntington's disease is there as a consequence of European ancestry, but it is being managed and treated within an Indigenous context because the people who have the disease identify themselves and live as Indigenous Australians. Jo?
Can I thank you both? I think that was an absolutely fascinating presentation from somebody who really doesn't know very much about this, and the potential seems obvious even to a non-medical researcher. But I may have missed this point, so excuse me if I have, but the people whose blood samples are currently being held, how will you contact either that person or their families to get a consent to continue to use those samples for future research?
Well, can you hear me without this? I'm not sure if it's working, but yeah, it varies from place to place. But in all cases, we have been. So, if I can, perhaps the most recent work we've been doing is in the Kimberley. We work with the Kimberley Aboriginal Medical Service Council and with the Kimberley Aboriginal Law and Cultural Centre. So we're with the regional cultural and medical organisations, with community elders and shire managers and PBCs or whatever the legal structures that are relevant, and then approach families with everybody knowing what we're doing and explaining to. But we go back to every single family that is involved, and if the person has passed away, then we ask the family if there's someone who can speak for them. If there isn't, we don't.
It's even got at the beginning, Gillian. We went to the Kimberley Law and Culture Centre, which is this peak body, and they actually started advising us who should even get access to the lists of names. So we've tried to do it properly all the way through, that who should even see the list of names that people. So it's a very firm decision of the governance board that until people give their consent or descendants give their consent, that they'll stay in the closed collection and won't move into the open collection. So, and we've got to maintain that. If we actually do one person out of the 6,000, we'd blow all of the credibility that we've built up over the last 2 or 3 years. So it's fairly expensive. But to give you an example, when we went to Calac in the first trip, there's people in Copenhagen with, I don't know, 10,000 hair samples. Not that many, but there's another group in Australia with a whole lot down in South Australia, and the Kimberley mob told us we don't want them people to come back here from Copenhagen. They're not welcome here anymore. And I said, why? And they said, well, they told us we don't come from here. And they said, you know, and it's a way you present stuff, a classic way to present things. They said, oh, we don't come from here, we Africans. They told us we were Africans. So what they tried to explain was, you know, everyone come out of Africa, and instead of, they missed the 70,000 year bit, but they could have framed it another way to say, well, we've actually got proof you've been here 70,000 years. We've got scientific proof, but they didn't. So until now, that affects us because there's a group in South Australia that engages with those Copenhagen researchers who want to join with the centre. And we're saying, well, now hang on, you've got to go and fix that problem up before you can join with us, because our reputation so far is, you know, fairly new, and there's no way we're ever going to put that reputation at risk, because they've told us fairly clearly they don't want to work with those Copenhagen researchers. So it's a bit fraught, as anyone, I keep on finding out. You know, if you think of university politics, and it's probably the worst form of politics I've come across in a while, but this happens. So we've said very clearly to the Australian group, you've got to sort your relationship out before you come and work with us.
So I could add to that. There is another approach which is used, which is simply to detach the sample, the blood sample or the DNA from the person and make it anonymous. And we've absolutely decided not to do that for a variety of reasons, but not least of which, you just lose so much by doing that. By retaining that connection, there are all of the engagement aspects of it, but also from a medical research point of view, you lose a huge amount from doing that. So that's something we've decided that we're not going to do.
We'll take Michael and last three, because I think people want to get moving. I know you're all afternoon, by the way. But...
Thanks for that fascinating and challenging presentation. And the project sounds indeed important. I'm interested in some of the cultural and historical issues, and wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how you're proceeding with repatriation and return from what sounds like a huge amount of records.
Well, we're at this stage, we're not, excuse me, we're not, we haven't returned anything. We're talking to people about how they would like us to do that. That's an evasive answer, but it's the truth. I mean, we want to do things the way people would like us to do them.
Yeah, for example, Maunjum, we've got like the community moved about 30 years ago. There's actually a map of where people lived in the old Maunjum community, which is really, really important. But the new, and if you know anything about Aboriginal art, they're the custodians of the Indigenous. So they've got this great infrastructure behind the Maunjum where these both the written records and the photographs can just plug into for the Maunjum people. But there's not many people with that sort of infrastructure behind. So probably the first port of call will be the Maunjum people, because they've engaged right from day one on this, and it's been really positive. But it was simply because we had a record. The first thing they got, and we had a record of a map of the old Maunjum community. So and people like Randy Spargo and Karen O'Day, who were up there, they're fairly well remembered. They've remembered really fondly up there, those two doctors, you know. So I think Randy still does work up there. So a whole lot of this is building trust, and we don't want to certainly release it to people who don't have the authority to hold it. So, as a matter of fact, the Warrabinda samples, I'm not allowed to even look at the records of things because my family comes from Warrabinda, so Simon keeps me away from that. So we're trying to do it right, even through members of the governance board aren't allowed to look at stuff that they shouldn't be looking at.
It sounded to me too, and thank you very much as well. I found it really interesting, your both of your talks. It sounded as if you're also trying to develop a consent model in consultation, which is very impressive and I'm sure very complex. And I was wondering what you're doing with that issue of dynamic consent, since Commissioner Gooda referred to the fact that genetic information can be continued in perpetuity and also that it has unimagined future uses. What you do about consent to those uses, is this idea of dynamic consent going to continue on into the future with descendants, for example?
So that's a really good question, and I could put that diagram up that I didn't show you, but we probably might be here half the afternoon working our way through it. So at this stage, we are asking people, we will ask people to consent to either make their sample available for sequencing within the collection. People can give a fresh sample if they want to. The people who've already got a collection of the sample, because it's from our point of view, it's much easier to work with fresh material. Or people, we've had a lot of people interested in joining that. So that what they're consenting to is being part of the collection. That will only be, all we'll do is the kind of work that we need to do in order to build the collection. The access to it from outside will be controlled by Indigenous Access Committee, and we're going to bring the various people together to work out exactly how that works. And then the dynamic consent is that in both of those contexts, somebody can see exactly what their material has been used for, all of the projects that have been involved in, and have notification beforehand that they can say, no, I don't want to be part of that particular one. There is the reporting back issue as well. That's a part of that. But the issue about the future generations, I can't remember the wording on the information sheet exactly, but there is, I can't remember exactly how we dealt with, which I think simply means that we will, again, what we have is provisional, and we will discuss this with people about how to do that. But that's an issue that goes beyond Indigenous genomics. These databases get set up, and they relate to family members. It's not like when you die, your stuff disappears. It has implications for your family.
I guess there's that extra level of history of exploitation.
Yeah. Yes.
And that's what we're very careful of doing. That's why I said at the beginning, it's sort of now grown into two projects. One is about consent and the ethical framework and how that works, plus the scientific side of it. But can I just say, when we went to Cherbourg, we met a lot of people who'd actually given their samples, because they're only school kids. And they raised the issue Simon raised. No one, and because it was Cherbourg near Brisbane, they said, oh, everyone was always up here with taking blood and was spitting in cups and all that stuff. But no one ever came back and told us. But this particular, we've got it's a really good story. It was different. The Queensland samples were different to most of the other samples in that it was a project done by the Queensland Institute of Medical Research, because kids on the Aboriginal communities were just failing to thrive. And the infant mortality rate was just horrendous compared to the general infant mortality rate. And the researchers originally said, oh, these kids are okay, and they underestimated their age by about 2 or 3 years. They said, oh, they're good for 4-year-olds, but they're actually 7 years old. So these kids were, and it was tabled in the Queensland Parliament, and it was one of the first uses of the power after the 1967 referendum, where the Commonwealth intervened in a state matter. And it was, so we're getting a lady who done her PhD on this and found this stuff out to write about that, because it's actually a really good story, because they were just rapt saying, oh geez, we didn't even know this, but we're saying you're pretty important historically, because it's probably the first time the Commonwealth used its power under 5126 after 67 and they started an Aboriginal health program in Queensland because the situation of the kids was so dire. So that's a part of that history, and I think it's really important not only getting consent, but like Simon said, keep on going back to people. So, and I've got to say, I've never seen it before, the number of people putting their hands up, because 6,000, you've got to take a bit of a strategic approach. So we said the Kimberley top end in Queensland, then any other community want to talk to us, we'll go out. More and more communities putting their hands up and saying we want to talk to you about this. So it's pretty good. And even I mentioned those 2 containers of remains. We think we might be able, if CALAC agree, we can actually analyse the DNA out of those, and we can place them, province them back to where the communities, and they can actually go and rebury those remains, which is a great ceremony if ever you get an opportunity to go and see it. It's bringing people back from overseas. So even in that, we'll say the material belongs to CALAC, and they'll control what they do with it. So just trying to make sure we don't cut any corners. And I think I've written about the amount of time and effort and resources we're putting in at the front end of this process will certainly benefit at the back end when we get to that use stage, I reckon. So we're going to take one more question.
It's been answered, actually. Already. Something you just said.
Well, look, can I thank everyone for coming? It's a project that I'm excited about to be involved. I finish shortly and hand it over to someone else, but it's been really exciting to get this done. And like I said, a couple of presentations time, Simon will put my genome up there, and then we'll find out where I come from. So I'm waiting with bated breath to find out, is there any blue there? Is it too much orange or whatever? So I'm waiting to see how that pans out. But can I thank Simon for coming along? And thank you guys for coming along and showing interest. But just be aware that we'll be writing about this in this year's Social Justice Native Title Report. So you've got a bit of a heads up on what we'll be writing about. So thank you again.
Thank you, Mick, for inviting me.